the word conductor is really unusual in the English language, because if you look at most languages, you have there's an impression of leadership or of kind of force, like Dirigent in German, or they say chef d'orchestre. There's always a feeling of being in charge of it, but actually our word conductor, if you think in the electrical scientific sense, it's more to do with this kind of sense of flow. And so I think the job is much more just connecting the circuit of all the players, whether it's opera, whether it's an orchestra. Ultimately, it's the feeling of so many different personalities coming together, whether it's different members of an orchestra, whether it's involving a chorus or solo singers in an opera, all those very different people who are basically experts at what they do. In a way, reducing the individual, reducing the sense of ego, and actually it's about the bigger picture, but also you've got all these people who are just phenomenal at what they do, technically, artistically, kind of doing that thing at the same time. And I think it's that community aspect, which or not community, but communal, and the idea that actually if you have a room with people who are world class at the very specific thing that they do, which could be from playing the triangle, to playing the cor anglais or whatever it might be, all of those things together, it's quite an amazing energy, not in a Zen way, but actually just the feeling of loads of people doing that at the same time. That is a kind of an energy that you get from an orchestra, and you also then give back to the orchestra. And I think that, it's like the most addictive drug probably in the world. You have to, particularly when you're a guest conductor, is you have to unlock the best that the orchestra can play. And so if, it's not necessarily about creating a sound with the orchestra, it's this idea of, let's play as well as we can. And then I think the concept of sound is very different, because in a way, the way I like to think about composers is that it's not my sound or an orchestra sound, but it's Dvorak's sound or Brahms' sound. And so, in the same way that if you have a really good actor, you don't think about the actor's personality or the actor off the stage or off the set. They're so consumed into that character that that's just who it is. And so in a way, I'd rather create a sound where you think, yeah, that's Dvorak, that's Brahms, rather than that's that orchestra playing Dvorak or Brahms. It's just a very, very subtle thing, but actually I just think that that's the kind of the job of creating that. Yes, it's an interpretation, and of course it's not objective, but I think it's finding the right thing for the composer that you're working on so that it's consistent and actually convincing. I think for me what's important is constantly questioning what's going on, and often I kind of think through the question words, first of all, okay, what's happening? What instruments do we have? What notes are they playing? When are they playing? You can then get into kind of why, and you think, okay, so why does the clarinet take over this melody from the oboe here? And then you can get a kind of logic for the piece. But I think it's just a constant, never-ending dialogue with the score, which I imagine doesn't stop for, Herbert Blomstedt just turned 95. I don't think he stopped thinking about those things in dialogue with the score. That's the lesson to everyone, is that actually it's just a constant shifting of what's there. I think the idea that the score study process is finished is kind of, it doesn't exist, it's continuous. And the amount that you learn from an orchestra, a new orchestra or a performance or a particular performance about a piece, it's all adding to the experience of it. I think it's more normal for conductors to be younger, which is a big change, and I think there's a general democracy in orchestras, in opera companies, in any situation where there's lots of people working, where actually I think conductors have to be team players, and people have to want to play for certain conductors. And I think that that's the biggest compliment you can ever get, is that an orchestra or singers enjoy working with you. And you hear lots of stories, but you think actually it should be like that. I think there's no question, and I think that's what's changed a lot. This idea of a kind of autocratic approach to the job, is disappeared for good, you know, which I think is a really positive aspect to the way things have changed. You listen to Toscanini's NBC recordings and you think they're amazing recordings, and they achieved them by an incredible dictatorship approach to working with the orchestra. But I also think that you don't have to. It's not a culture of fear. I think that so many relationships between conductors and orchestras, you know, in the kind of golden days of recording in the 20th century, you know, post-war 20th century, it was based on a culture of fear in music making, and I think it's exciting that we don't have that anymore. I think it's a really positive part of the way we do things, and that democracy in the group dynamic is really important. The challenge, first of all, of solving the problem of, okay, if this thing that's written down is the weird stuff that's in the composer's head, how do I then reverse their process and establish what they want to hear? You know, and I like that process. But also, I really love the fact that with a lot of new music, nobody else has ever conducted it, if it's a premiere, or very few. And so you feel kind of on your own in the relationship with the score. Whereas, of course, if you're doing a Brahms symphony, you know, you've got hundreds of years of tradition and recordings and resources available, which are great, but also can cloud things slightly. So I like the idea that actually it's just you and the score. And then also I've found with a lot of new music that you use the rehearsal progression to kind of add on to the part of the learning the score process. Whereas a lot of the symphonic repertoire, you arrive with a strong sense of what you're going to do. I kind of like to leave things a little bit open for the first rehearsal, because of course then developing the interpretation of the piece is part of the rehearsal process. You know, and so I think that challenge in new music I love. I imagine, and I'm not comparing being a conductor to being a doctor, because it's quite, there's an element of life-saving and there's not in conducting, but I think that it's probably the same process that a doctor who works in the emergency, you know, ER or casualty, compared to being a GP. Because I think there must be a lot of adrenaline that doctors must have to work out how to suppress to then think clearly and do the job, in a more pressured way. And I think jump-ins are the same, because of course you do get the initial adrenaline, but then you channel that adrenaline into thinking clearly and just working energetically for a long period of time to be ready for whatever's coming next. And I think it's a different style of working to preparing for next week's concert that's happening in a very easy. That's the GP surgery appointment way of doing it. So I think it's channeling the energy, and actually I think putting it in the context of the world. You know, what's the worst that can happen? You know, it's not. No one's. I hope no one's dying. It's a great responsibility, and actually with jump-ins, people are thankful that you're putting yourself in the position of doing it. So things can only really go well because you're helping, you're saving what's happening, which is people appreciate, I think.